Welcome to the Inside Scoop Live podcast, where indie authors get personal about their books, their writing, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt. Join me for some lively conversations with debut indie authors and seasoned veterans alike. It's a great place to find your next amazing read or even get inspired. So sit back and enjoy the show and let me know what you think. Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by Joi Lesin, author of The Passenger. It's a captivating historical novel about a widow who can communicate with the dead and a war veteran confronting his past, brought together by a long-lost father's ghost. It's a story of love, loss, and the search for redemption. Before we get started, here's the inside scoop on the author. Award-winning author Joi Lesin crafts character-driven, emotional stories of heartache and hope, often exploring the otherworldly. Originally from Massachusetts, she now lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, with her husband and blended family, including a lively grand corgi. Though she misses the ocean, she enjoys lakeside walks and frequent trips to the coast, especially California, her home away from home. A passionate music lover, Joi finds many of her story ideas sparked by songs, particularly live performances. To learn more about Joi Lesin and her work, visit her website at joilesin.com. Well, hi, Joi. Welcome to Inside Scoop Live.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you and to learn more about you and your work. So I guess to get us started, why don't you tell us about your book, The Passenger? What's the story about and what inspired you to write it?
Well, The Passenger, it's the story of a young widow, Elizabeth Reilly. She's an empath, which means she is able to communicate with the dead. And when they appear to her, they're alive. So after losing her husband as a casualty of World War II in a chance encounter with a dying man, she befriends the dying man's ghost. To help him find peace and to be able to pass on, she travels from her home in Boston to California's wine country. When she arrives there, she discovers her task won't be so easy. To help her friend, she first must help the living family he left behind.
I love that storyline. And what was your inspiration behind the story? How did that story come to you?
Well, when I was younger, I've always been a storyteller. I've always had imaginary friends for as long as I can remember. But I used to, when I was a teenager and I started playing this game with myself, I'd play the what if game. So wherever I was, if I was on the bus on the way home from school, I would play this what if game. So one day I was on the city bus instead of taking the school bus home from school when I was in high school. And I saw this man in the back of the bus and I started playing the what if game for him. And so what I did in my head is I would make up stories for people.
Oh,
Full backstories, what their story was for being where they were on that day. So I made up a story for this man, and where my mind went, it was, what if he died right here on this bus? Would anybody aid him? Would anybody, so that's where the story started, with a man dying in my mind on the bus and the person who aided him in his last breaths.
Oh my goodness.
That's the day I met the ghost in the story, Gio Clemente.
I love your imagination and how you come up with your stories. Oh, that's great. Now, the setting is World War II, and I love that it blends historical and supernatural elements. What drew you to the time period? And then how did you weave the supernatural into this kind of historical setting?
Well, I've always been fascinated by the World War II and the post-World War II era. As a kid, I loved to watch the old movies. If you had a day off of school or you were homesick, I would watch those old movies. So I'd watch the movies depicting the time. And I also listened to the music because it was my mother's music when she was a child. So she played it for me. And then not to mention, my own parents met during the post-World War II era. My father had come, where my mother grew up in Minnesota, to stand in proxy for a groom who couldn't be there. And the two people were mutual friends of my parents, and that's how they met.
Wow. Now that's a what if story, huh? What if he hadn't filled in? Yeah.
Yep.
Love it.
As far as weaving in the supernatural, for The Passenger, those elements were essential to the story. Without them, there wouldn't be a story. So incorporating the ghost story was an easy thing for me to do and a must.
Yeah, yeah. What about finding the right balance between the realism and the supernatural? Did you find that tricky?
I think one of the ways I achieve the balance is I focus on the emotional journey of each character.
Mm,
I do go into, who those characters are. I think my stories are very character driven. So that makes it easy when you're inside those characters and the deep point of view of the characters. And one thing I will add is that the balance came easy to me when writing the story. Sometimes it felt like the story seemed to just write itself. And so there
mm.
wasn't a concern of the balance of it. It just was a natural thing.
Okay, okay. You had a supernatural kind of writing it for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ah. Digging a little deeper, the passenger explores themes of loss and resilience and identity. Were there any themes that emerged unexpectedly as you wrote, or was this kind of in your mind the whole time?
Well, I knew when I was writing this story that I would explore grief and healing, but I didn't decide ahead of time which themes would come to the forefront.
Hmm.
These themes emerged during the telling of the story. But one of the themes that came through and that did surprise me when a reviewer picked up on it was the theme of living for the day,
Mm.
living in the present moment. This is something I try to practice in my life to the best of my ability. So once the reviewer did point that out, it felt right. I was surprised that that came through,
Mm.
but happy that it came through and surprised how just as you're writing the story, themes do come up as you're telling them. And I loved that review that they pointed that out.
I love that too because it's like you didn't know you wanted to hear that, but once you heard it, it's like, oh yes, and it was just part of your personality coming through in the
Mhm.
writing. I love that. Now, what about the contrasting landscapes of the East and West Coast? How did these settings kind of symbolize within the narrative?
Well, I will say choosing these two locations was personal for me. I was born on the East Coast. At the time of writing The Passenger, I had never been to California. So that was a place I wanted to go.
Oh,
So Boston was my past where I was born. And then I hoped California to be a future location for me. So it was kind of personal. But where Elizabeth was concerned, the weather during her time, the time of the year that she was home in Boston, the weather depicted kind of how she was feeling and the emotional journey she was going through with the early spring at the ocean and the cold and being bundled up as she waited for one special ghost to come and say goodbye. And then she was steeped in grief, struggling to accept herself and feel accepted for her ability, and
mm,
was searching for peace. And there was also Elizabeth's opening scene when she's on the streetcar and it's hot. It's hot summer on the East Coast and heat is streaming in through the streetcar windows and it's oppressive. So it's reflecting how she's feeling. Once she
mm,
gets to California, there's the ancient sense of the earth that she notices, the sun filtering through the conifer trees. And there's also the breeze blowing through the vineyard and
mm.
applauding a beautiful day at one point, she thinks. So she's opening up and learning to accept who she is. So the different landscapes do reflect how she's feeling.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, let's talk a little about Elizabeth. She's your protagonist. She's a young widow, you said, with an empathic gift. What inspired her character? How did you develop her unique abilities?
Well, she was inspired on that first day of that when I first met Paulo. They're playing my what if game.
Okay.
So she was the person that came to the aid of the dying man. I suppose, though, I was inspired to write a lead character with this amazing gift from the types of stories I love to read or watch as a child. And, the movies, like I love The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. Remember watching that.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
so I wanted a character who could communicate for whatever reason. And one of the themes that I haven't talked a lot about is Elizabeth did inherit this gift from her mother.
Mm,
And there's kind of a low-lying mystery there of where their family gift came from. So it's also talking about inheriting things and inheriting traits. So she
yeah.
was the reason for the story because ultimately this is Elizabeth's journey.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about Giovanni, Gio Clemente. He has a complicated relationship with his past. How did you approach kind of crafting his journey, particularly in terms of, abandonment and reconciliation?
Mhm. Well, for each character, I do listen to them and let them lead me in the direction they need to go.
Mm.
I know when I sit down to write a character, the ultimate goal is their growth. And in the end, Gio needed to heal, and he needed to dig deep and understand the walls he built to avoid dealing with difficult emotions. So I dove into his character and listened for each action and reaction that would be authentic to his character. And he did hide away from his emotions, and he was also very protective of his mother. And he misinterpreted her grief of losing his father. And so Gio was, hiding away from emotions. And so he had to learn to open up in order to forgive.
Yeah. He was just a child, right, when that happened? Is that
Yes,
right?
he really did not remember his father at all because Paulo left for America when Gio was just a baby.
Okay. Now, the relationship between Elizabeth and Gio, does that happen immediately? Tell us a little bit about their relationship.
They were drawn to each other immediately, while Gio didn't necessarily trust Elizabeth's reasons for being there.
Mm.
There was something about her. There was that caring aura that she carried with her wherever she went, and that drew him to her. Elizabeth, was had immediate empathy for showing up on the Clemente's door to bring them news of Paulo. And she had immediate empathy with the grief because she was grieving herself over the death of her husband. So
Mm.
they were drawn to each other in those ways. They were, in a way, both caring people in their own way. And, they'd both been through life. Elizabeth had already been married, loved and lost. And, they were both ready for something more in their life, even if they didn't know what it was.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about being, fascinated with that era, that World War II and post era, and the supernatural elements as well. What kind of research did you have to do to bring this story together? Was there a lot of detailed research, or did a lot of the story come together organically through your imagination?
A lot of it was definitely organically. I've always read about the time, loved history class in school, always watched the movies. So a lot of it I just picked up through osmosis. And,
Hmm.
but when I would get to a part in the story where I needed to know something more, I would do research on that piece. But one of the things I did, I kind of steeped myself in the time by listening to the music. I read nonfiction literature when I needed to about even things that didn't end up making it into the book, but just I needed to know as I told the story.
Hmm.
Um, and then one of the fun things I did, I would go to the library and I did dig through the archives to look at old magazines from the time period, and not necessarily even reading the stories in it, just looking at the pictures. And I even would go to antique stores and buy the magazines. I have a few copies of magazines from the 1940s, some of my prized possessions. It just helped me to steep in the time. It helped me feel like I was there.
Absolutely. What a great way to set the mood. Was there any scene or character that surprised you by taking an unexpected direction during the writing process?
Absolutely. Adriana Clemente, Gio's mother, and the ghost Paulo's wife. I hadn't expected her to be so prominent in the story. I realized it when I wrote the scene where she first met Paulo back at the Clemente Vineyard in Italy, that she had a voice and she wanted to use it.
Hmm.
In the scene, incidentally, was written when I was in the flow. It felt seriously like stream of conscious writing. And it almost word for word is in the book how I first wrote it. It was one of those magical moments. And it's probably one of my favorite scenes that I've ever written.
Wow.
And I love that character. And I've seen in reviews and have heard people say she's one of their favorite characters. So,
Wow. That kind of gives me chills because it kind of feels like, like you said, just kind of like intervention. Somebody was moving that pen.
yeah, my mother used to say, because my mother used to be one of my first readers of my stories, and she would always say sometimes, she said, it feels like you're just channeling these stories. These stories happen somewhere out there and you're just listening and channeling them. And that was always special to me. So I kind of try to think of it that way.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Mhm.
perfect. Yeah. The supernatural genre continues to resonate with readers. Why do you think that is? And how do you put your unique spin on it?
I think for the supernatural genre, why it resonates with people is because each story does deal with real life issues, But by adding the supernatural, readers are able to gain a new perspective, look at it in a different way, and maybe sometimes put a little layer between themselves and that issue because they're looking at it in a fantastical way. And for me, I incorporate those elements as a way to deal with acceptance and grief and healing, especially with my ghost stories.
Okay. Now, you talked a little bit about readers responding to Gio's mother. Did you have any other reactions like that that stood out to you? And what have other readers been saying about your story?
Well, one of the things what I've heard is that while the supernatural elements is what attracted them to the story, when they're in the story and getting lost in the story, they're finding it's the living character's journey that keeps them there and that they start really rooting for.
Oh, wow. Yeah. 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 I thought you were going to say the historical aspect. I like to learn my history through historical fiction.
Mhm.
It's more fun that way, but oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Have any readers interpreted any aspects of the story in ways that kind of surprised you or gave you a new perspective?
The healing element. And when I sat down to write, I didn't say I wanted these specific themes. And like I said, the story, as I write it, those themes reveal themselves.
Hmm.
But there's been more than one review, and I've had more than one reader tell me that by reading the story, it's a way to help people deal with their own grief,
Oh,
which was touching to me. It's like, I'm giving something back if somebody reads this and it helps them view their own grief in a certain way. If I'm able to do that, it feels special. So,
yeah, that's wonderful. Were you expecting that kind of feedback?
no, I wasn't that it would touch people in that way. I do know when I read, the reason why I'm a writer, I've always been a reader, and books have always given me a gift. It's, the history part. I've learned things, I've read something in a story, and then it piques my curiosity, and I'll go look for it. I'll learn more about that piece of history. But,
Yeah.
you learn empathy through reading. I remember reading The Little Princess when I was a child and feeling for the character, or reading The Secret Garden. And so I know that books give you a gift and you learn things and you feel things and you may be a more open, empathetic person through reading. And so it does touch that in some way. I've been able to give that back. It's a gift that I've received. And then it's one I get to pay forward with my stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Nice. I guess if there's one thing you'd like readers to take away from The Passenger, what would it be?
It would be the gift of healing, that there is healing. I've lost some special people in my life, and thinking of them in a way like thinking of Paulo Clemente and the possibility of him being there, still existing, helps. And so I hope The Passenger gives hope, and also people can identify, not feel alone, because there may be feelings that they're feeling, though these are fictional characters, that it makes you realize that it's a human experience and
Right.
other people are feeling these things.
Right. Right. I mean, you can't tell me when I'm watching a TV show that that character's not real because I am
Yeah.
all about what's going on with them, you know?
Yep.
Same way with books. Yeah. So your fascination with otherworldly ghosts, mermaids, and beyond clearly influences your work. How did these interests shape The Passenger?
These interests didn't just shape The Passenger. The story wouldn't have come to fruition without them,
Hmm.
because it began with a ghost after all. It's just how my imagination works. I will be surprised if I ever write a story that doesn't have one of these elements. So it starts with the paranormal, I guess, just like The Passenger started with the
Yeah.
ghost.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Do you have plans to write a sequel to The Passenger?
I am currently on what I believe is my final draft of a book that takes place 20 years, 2 decades later on the Clemente vineyard. I don't have any information yet about when it would be available, but that's what I'm working on now. It began with a scene that came to me while I was writing The Passenger. I'm not going to share that scene yet, but with the story, how I'm thinking about it is it's 1968 and the ghosts are gathering.
Oh, okay. Nice, nice. Now you're also interested in music. You mentioned the music from the era. Aside from music, what other forms of art or media kind of inspire your storytelling?
Photographs. One of the things I like to do for fun is take photos. And a lot of times with my photos, I'll write poetry from them. So I'll look at the picture, just like my what if game. I
Yeah.
take the photo and then I'll say, what is the story in this photo?
Oh,
And usually there is not a person in the photo, but I try to write poetry from the perspective of a person who's taking the photo, not me, but a character. And so photos have been a big sense of inspiration. And recently I've been writing a lot of poems incorporating mermaids because I just love the legend of mermaids. So photos, and then of course the music.
nice. Do you have like a playlist of music that you mention in your novel, or do you not mention song titles specifically?
I try not to mention song titles, but I'll make references
Okay,
to
right,
that.
right.
But I do create a playlist for each book that I'm writing that I'll play if I don't need to be deep in the scene without any background noise. I have a playlist that I'll play with the book I'm working on now, since it's taking place. Actually, it's taking place in 1969. I have music from that time.
Ooh,
And it
fun.
ends up being a lot of the music that I listen to. Like, I try not to deviate and listen to other music I like. I try to stay steeped in that time. And for The Passenger, it was all big band music from the 1940s.
Yeah. What about your writing style? How has your writing style evolved over time?
My writing style is immersive. When I write and edit a scene, I always ask myself what is happening around the character, what are they feeling, both internally and externally, seeing, hearing, and smelling, and what are the scents around them? What does it tell the reader about where they are? And how do each of these things reflect the character's emotions in the current scenes? And I try my best to pull the reader in. I believe my writing style tended to do this naturally, but as I've matured as a writer, I try to be more intentional using those things when I do write.
Okay, okay, yeah. What advice would you offer to writers who want to blend supernatural elements with historical fiction?
Yeah, I would say do your research. One, steep yourself in the history through whatever means best suits your personality and your research style.
Hmm.
For me, it's the music and the photos. And then let your imagine take over to weave in those supernatural elements. I think it's good to know what has been done with the fantasy genre, paranormal genre, but allow yourself to create something brand new.
Okay, great advice. Great advice. Joy, is there anything else you wanted to share with our listeners today?
Sure. Well, The Passenger and its characters have lived inside my mind for so long. They first came to me when I was 16 years old on that bus. And the story started with that idea, and I never gave up on it. It took me a while to finally sit down and write it. But when I finally did, I had two small children. I worked full time, and I fit my writing in the cracks of
Wow.
time. I stayed up late. I was sleep deprived, probably even more sleep deprived than when they were babies. But I just knew it was the time, and I had to finally sit down and write the story. So I just committed to it. And when doing it, I felt like my most authentic self. And I'm glad that I made myself do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And where can readers go to learn more about you and your work?
I have a website, jlesin.com. I also am on almost all the socials, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Threads, and Blue Sky. And also on my publisher website, thewildrosepress.com.
Okay. Lots of ways to reach out or buy a book. Well, Joy, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing a bit about yourself and your work. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me, and it was a fun interview.
Thank you so much for joining me today for my interview with Joi Lesin, author of The Passenger. You can learn more about Joi Lesin and her work by visiting her website at jlesin.com. And be sure to check out our other interviews at InsideScoopLive.com.